Hello, everybody. This is Meredith from Open to Source, and I am very excited to be here tonight for our second week of the Splenda Karika's immersion. As a reminder for anybody on the phone, if you do have questions during the Q&A period, *2 will raise your hand, and we will be able to field your question that way. For everybody on the web, of course, you use the form that is on the web page where you're listening. And without further ado, I will hand things right over to Chris.
Good evening from upstate New York on this lovely fall day. Leaves just starting to peak. Great moment of transition in the Splenda from the seasonal point of view. Great moment to have this class, in fact, with the moon growing full, or perhaps it's full, I think, tomorrow night. And we want to apologize, first of all, for the delay in the handouts coming out, but I think you'll find it's well worth it. I had some family stuff going on, but that led to me doing some all-nighters. And in the midst of doing some all-nighters, as is common with me, I really uncovered some gorgeous nuggets that really shows me that we're really taking baby steps into a lot of this stuff, particularly what I'd like to present tonight, which is the full background of the Krumma lineage, the post-tantric ecstatic movement of internalized worship that developed in the figure of the sage Gyananetra. Now, it'd be great if you had your handouts with you tonight, either both ready to maximize on your computer screen or printed before you. So I'll be referring to both. The two handouts are, let's see, what did I entitle? Yeah, Week 2 SK handout, meaning Splenda Karika handout, is the name of the main handout. And the second one will be covers a diversion that I like to take with you, a very, very special introductory journey into the 12 Kalis of the Krumma lineage, and that's the name of the other document. So that's about it. We'll refer to those two. I'll occasionally reference the introduction to Tantra handout from Week 1, but you need not have that out necessarily. I'm barely going to touch on it. So where we left off in our introduction was a very, very pivotal moment in which I began to explain this really ancient revelation that's been largely unnoticed until now, made by our commentator, Kshemarajah. Now, Kshemarajah, who lived in the 11th century and is known to some of you for his work, for other works such as the Heart of Recognition. If you studied with Harish Wallace, you know all about that. The Pratyabhigya Hridayam, his fabulous work of 20 sutras that explain, or that basically revels in the thrill of what it is like to live in the state of Jivan Mukti, living liberation. Now, Kshemarajah, the disciple of Abhinavagupta, was Kashmirian through and through. And his greatest influence was, just to sort of recap, his greatest spiritual influence was a burgeoning spiritual movement that comes directly out of Shaiva Tantra. And that is, again, called the Krumma, Krama, which means sequence. And what we find in the Krumma, particularly in the legendary initiation story by the Krumma's founder, Gyananetra, he who has the inner eye of wisdom. Again, this is all on the Intro to Tantra handout under the Krumma section. But what we find is a complete revelation and revolution and involution. All those words apply to how one practices yogic ritual. Simply put, for centuries, tantric ritual, which really was a series of ritualized yoga practices, including breath lengthenings, breath extensions, pranayama, the placement of mantra deities to stimulate an awakening of energy in the body that will break through the blocks, the emotional gunk that we carry for many lifetimes that keeps us from experiencing our own naturally enlightened state. The manipulation of these mantras, or the movement of these mantras to break these blockages through very refined practices of breath retention as well as breath lengthening. That is to say, a practice that treats the body as the, let's say, locus of divinity, that we are the microcosm of Lord Shiva, and our prana is Shakti, energy. And through the free will of the divine to create, to play, to manifest, as we'll be looking at tonight, we've become human. No two human beings are the same. No two cells of the body, no two existent things in the universe are the same, and yet all vibrate on the ocean of pure consciousness. This is good old tantric yoga ritual, and the goal of the ritual is not worship of an exterior power like a god out there, but rather we are microcosms of the divine who seek to rediscover our divinity, to recognize our divinity through daily ritualized yoga, literally called internal puja or worship. This is standard tantric yoga. Every lineage did this practice every day. It was called for those that really like technical terms, but don't feel you have to memorize all this stuff, it was called nitya puja, daily worship, which is a very fancy and I think lovely way of saying daily yoga. So before the Krama lineage arose, we had this in all of the major tantric schools. Now, the tantric schools were all supported by or based upon tantras, which are revealed teachings on how to do ritual. That's all they are. And who are they revealed by? None other than Shiva or Shakti. Those of you that have grown up in the Jewish tradition will recognize this whole theme, just like the books of the Torah, even though revealed to Moses, the 5 books are from a divine source, not to be questioned. And in the same way, the Tantras are. But what we find by the mid to late 9th century, so after around the year 850 A.D., is, of course, as one would expect, a burgeoning movement of human practitioners who've been doing this novel and quite revolutionary form of sound-based yoga for centuries, refining their own systems, particularly those that honor the great goddess as supreme. So the first of these, at least this is my feeling, my argument at the moment here as we take baby steps in scholarship. I say that tongue-in-cheek because we've only been looking at these sources for 40 years with any degree of accuracy. Let me check that. We've been looking at them for more than 40 years, perhaps for 40 years with some degree of accuracy, and maybe for the last 15 with a refined sense of understanding. So you're jumping in at the very beginning, folks. But in any event, as we discover these texts that have been hidden, lost, secured in government establishments, etc., after the movement was wiped out, what we find is, or the evidence points to, the earliest major human-based post-tantric movement is the Krama. Krama meaning sequence, wherein the goddess powers that are worshipped externally and internally are now internalized further to be the very pulsations of consciousness themselves. That's to say that the very pulsations or vibration of nature, the creation, stasis, and dissolution of all things, that is the law of nature itself, vibration, right down to the quantum level, is also experienced inside of our heads as well as outside. Now, the big difference between a school like the Krama and that of, let's say, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is quite striking in that Patanjali And the tantrics both agree on the definition of yoga, that yoga is the state of awakening, the state of connection, the state of freedom from suffering that has the singular quality of the cessation or dissolution of anxious mental preoccupation or the whirling thoughts of anxiety. So both agree on this. The difference is Patanjali believed that the soul, which is immortal, gets entangled in this mess of a body and its sensual preoccupations, and that embodiment itself causes chitta-vritti, which sort of makes sense from his perspective. We get caught up in the body's desires, needs, wants, fears, etc., and therefore we have anxious, repetitive thinking, which creates a cloud or an opaque screen to our own divinity. Patanjali's goal in assigning yoga was to escape this body, to be free, to withdraw the soul, the inner witness, from bodily engagement, and indeed with that from thoughts and emotions as well. Here we have in the Krama lineage a complete revision of this, wherein the pulsations of thought, the pulsations of our emotions, the cyclical rise and fall of our feelings throughout the day are not only considered to be part of the divine process, they are considered to be goddesses. And so Kali has multiplied herself into many forms, and these are the very phases of our awareness that we experience. So the Krama then is the major influence of our friend Kshemaraja. If the Krama was founded around the year 850, it had been around 200 years by Kshemaraja's time. It was highly influential to his teacher, Abhinavagupta, and the Spanda tradition, or the Spandakarikas in particular, which really is the tradition, the 52 stanzas or karikas on vibration, according to Kshemaraja, is directly a work of the Krama. So its author, the sage Kalata, although the authorship is disputed, I provided evidence last week to suggest that it is indeed Kalata and not his teacher Vasugupta. So I'll use Kalata for now on. Kalata himself and his work, the Spandakarikas, is a work of the Krama, according to Kshemaraja. And he provides ample evidence of this, which is pretty convincing, particularly in that no other text before, except Krama texts, actually go all out in describing and celebrating and worshiping the divine as the pulsation of life, as the movements of breath, particularly, specifically as the cycles of Shakti. And here we'll turn to our Week 2 handout. At the top it says, the Spandakarikas with Kshemaraja, Week 2. This is the bigger document. It's about 9 pages. Sorry if it was a bit hard to download, but I think it'll be worth it. So what I'd like to do then is to take us through his incredibly deep, incredibly, I think, life-changing, incredibly empowering, and sophisticated illumination on this most important first verse of the text. I should put a segue in here now, rather a caveat, that the table of contents is slightly off in that I missed a week. So what I meant to do, and you'll get a new version, so don't panic, we're going to send it out this week. But what I meant to do, and what I will do, is to cover verse 1 tonight in its entirety, meaning mainly Kshemaraja's commentary, and then we will move, I think it's verses 2 through 8 next week, move into that. But as Kshemaraja says, this first verse encapsulates the whole teaching of the Spandakarikas. I want to remind you to send in questions, those of you that wish to type them in, and I will definitely pause at certain points tonight to see if there are any. So at least try not to wait till I ask for questions, because there's a time gap there where you might get cut off just by typing it out. And I want to hear anything that anyone has to say. Okay, so we return to our first verse. We unpacked this just a bit for the last 15 minutes of the first class last week. top of week 2 handout. Yasyon Mesha Nimesha Byam Jagataha Pralayodayao Tam Shakti Chakra Vibhava Prabhavam Shankaram Stuma. Taken at face value, sounds like a pretty verse, but not necessarily the clearest to grasp, for sure. That goes without saying. And this is the whole point of these illustrious commentators. In a sense, one could argue that it's futile to even read a text like, let's say, the Shiva Sutras, which is an even more abbreviated version of, or really the antecedent of this text. The Spandakarikas are allegedly based on the Shiva Sutras, although there's some doubt in that. But in any event, without the explanation, without the spiritual illumination of masters like Kshemaraja, a lot of the key teachings, indeed, even the words, simple words, the power and depth that these words carry can be lost to us. So occasionally I'll be doing the Sanskrit of Kshemaraja's exposition on these verses. Let me just bring up the document I need here. 1 second. And there she is. Okay. So we define this as, or translated this as, it's in the plural, we praise Shankara, or Shiva, who is that omnipresent source consciousness that unfolds the cycles of Shakti, Shakti Chakra, through which the universe rises forth into existence, Unmesha, and dissolves Nimesha into dissolution. Now, the words Unmesha and Nimesha, existence or creation and dissolution, it could be translated in several ways. I often take Unmesha to be emergence, which really works well, I think, as we'll see. Birth is okay, but emergence or rising into existence perhaps is a little better. And the image, and we'll come to this visually soon, that perhaps best fits this verse and this whole teaching is the movement of a wave on the ocean. So we see that the ocean has a lull, and out of that lull, in which there seems to be a sthiti, a point of pause or stillness, we see the Unmesha, or literally the rising forth of the wave. And of course, it flops over on itself and dissolves back into its source. That's Nimesha. So I revised a little bit or added to a couple of these definitions, so I'm going to go through them even though I did them last week. So the first thing Kshemaraja does is to define the two principal characters, if you will, Shankara, that is to say Shiva, and Shakti. Now, again, we must not confuse these two with some form of anthropomorphic deity. For in this system, they are just pointers, words that refer to aspects of reality. Principally, Shiva is consciousness. And this is not the consciousness that we might have learned about in perhaps neurobiology class or in reading Western philosophical texts. That's to say, consciousness not necessarily in the sense of, or just in the sense of the awareness that's in my head through which I perceive the world through my senses, but rather consciousness with a big C. The whole universe is dynamic. This is Shakti. But the organizing principle, the intelligence, is consciousness. And so we can look in the world all around us and see the rhythms of creation, stasis, and dissolution in the changes of the year, such as the autumn season, representing that slide now into Nimesha of the calendrical year, the dissolution of life back into dormancy. We can look at all of the products or vibrations of this prestigious universe and see creation, stasis, and dissolution going on. But we can look also at, let us say, the plant kingdom and know that every living thing has its will to action, its will to power, as Nietzsche says somewhere. Each has its own intelligence, its instinctual knowledge on how to live, how to procreate, how to beget its future, how to protect its territory. Even plants turn towards the sun. There is plant consciousness. There's an intelligence that runs the universe, and this is no God, even though we say Shiva. And so the analogy is the ocean. The ocean of consciousness gives rise to the waves of form, which are nothing more than just that, waves of energy. Why? Because they're never permanent. He defines Shankara. Page 1. We praise that Shankara because he is the ultimate reality of one's own nature. He bestows, and here he breaks the word down. Kara means to give, to present, to bestow. He bestows the highest good, Sham. We praise him. That statement in the verse relates to the fact that he reveals the grace of one's true nature by eliminating one's egoic assumption of being the source agency, the source subject, that I am the source of my own reality. Or to be more clear, that I must protect this subject because I'm a finite being, instead of the fact that I'm much more than just a name and form and body, etc. My ultimate identity is Shiva, universal consciousness itself, the source pramater, the source subject. He eliminates this, for all expressions of the universe arise from him, and so we are all a part of him, or it, if you like. Again, not really anthropomorphic here, it's just that the noun is masculine. Indeed, this text, meaning the Spandakarikas, will show that immersion, samavesha, literally to immerse oneself, to absorb oneself, to unite oneself into this ocean of consciousness, into Shiva, grants the reward of living liberation, Jivan Mukti. And as I suggested last week, and this is not something I will say in an article just yet, but I am fairly certain that the phrase Jivan Mukti, or at least it's anything synonymous with that, the idea that one can be in a body and live in a state of enlightened existence. In Hinduism, that idea first arises in the Krama lineage, which in turn gives rise to this particular text, the Spandakarikas. Shakti. He defines Shakti as Spanda, the autonomous power of consciousness, Swatantriya. Shakti is the undivided, independent power of the unmoving, unchanging Lord, meaning Shiva, who is the very essence of consciousness itself. Never separate from this, she is the continual energetic sequence or sequential phases of dissolution and so on, creation, all of them. There is no agency other than she in movement itself. There's no other actor. There is no other force other than Shakti in the whole universe. She is the same as Spanda, vibration, meaning that is her nature, is vibration. Shakti means energy, and so Spanda is the effect of energy, uncoiling and recoiling itself, vibration. She is the concentrated throb that continually sets into motion the flux of objective reality, or in other words, of the world around us. What is it that is behind these patterns of vibration? And here we must take a break. We have to pause because the mind can't really conceive of this. Why? Because the mind is geared to think in a linear fashion. We think of birth as the beginning, death as the end. Some of my favorite atheists think like this. Perhaps they've been shocked by too much anthropomorphizing of God, and so this seems like the better route. But this system is somewhere in the middle. It's neither theist nor atheist. It is a glimpse into reality. And reality is vibration. So Shakti is vibration, Spanda itself. But what is she? He continues. We're still on page 1. So Shakti is vibration itself. She consists of the unspeakable bliss of condensed consciousness comprising the womb, which births the continual cycles of creation and destruction, responsible for the appearance of subjects and objects, judged as pleasant or unpleasant by us. Yet she who expresses herself as both expansion and contraction, as the flow of creation into dissolution, as the sequential, uninterrupted connection between birth and death, night and day, this and that, summer and winter, even happy and sad. She expresses herself as these things, and she is honored as the secret source of all reality. This is Kshemarajya. And so that's an introduction. And from there, he takes it further. And some of you are probably having either eureka moments, if you like this language, others perhaps along with questions. And rest assured that quite often characters like Kshemarajya, despite being, bliss bunnies who are just exploding with joy, it seems to me, somehow maintain a very logical flow in their explanation of things. So typically he's aware of what questions might arise. So I'm not going to break for a little while because some of the questions we may have, he may cover in these next sections. So page 2. So the subjects we'll be covering of his discussion on verse 1 are, first, the actual wave of consciousness. What does it mean? How do we unpack emergence, unmesha, and dissolution, nimesha? This will tie into the classic 5 acts of consciousness, the 5 movements of Shiva that one experiences in a body and in nature. And from there, we'll spend most of the remainder of our time unpacking the very cryptic, very beautiful, very powerful meaning of the phrase Shakti Chakra. All these are from the first verse. So Shakti Chakra is from the second line, the cycle or the circle of power, the circle of goddess powers that continually create, briefly maintain, and dissolve the universe back into its ineffable source. And in that section, I'm very excited to present to you some of one of the first forays into the original Krama text that give us this incredibly rich and very visual and appealing personification of the flow of awareness as goddess powers. So we'll hopefully get to that. And then finally, his last subject we'll cover is what is meant by we praise Shiva. Because Kshemarajya is very concerned that we don't make the mistake of thinking we're praising something other than our highest nature, and that the word praise itself will, of course, come to mean more of a practice than some kind of intellectual exercise. Okay, good. So, page 2. Here he discusses the wave of consciousness, the emergence and dissolution of consciousness that is the quality of all of reality. It is the nature of all reality, this flow between emergence, stasis, and dissolution. Okay. And I think I've said this already, but I'll occasionally read the Sanskrit on the shorter passages so we can get the real feel of how Kshemarajya would have taught this to his disciples. All right. Tatahi shivade kshityanta yasya yesha yasya tattvagramasya prakrishtasya samharta rupaya nimesha bor asaveva evod badadishaya dasha pekshaya shrashtor umesha bhumi tata Vishwa Nimesha Bhush Chidghana Tom Mesha Sara Chidganatanima Jana Bhumir Api Vishwom Mesha Rupa. And so in the phase of destruction or dissolution, samhara, Shakti is the agency of dissolution itself that withdraws all of the reality levels without exception from Shiva, ending with the earth. Let me pause here and say that Kshemaraj is referring to the grand vision of dissolution, the end of an age, when all the various reality levels and elements are absorbed back into Shiva. So he's looking at this for the moment in the big picture. Thus, she is that springboard for the dissolution of the universe. And this movement represents the reverse flow of all reality back into condensed consciousness. I love the phrase for condensed consciousness. This is called Chidganata, or Chidgana. It literally means, it's so hard to translate for me for some reason, but it literally means a congealed, a compacted ball of bliss. So this is the Big Bang. We can think about black holes, for instance, as drawing matter, which is really condensed energy, back into one point that, of course, flips into the Big Bang, universes dissolving and being born. Except here, that return to the Bindu point, the Bindu of the Sri Chakra, which we'll look at a little bit later, is Shiva, and that is condensed consciousness. Why? Because consciousness, when it emerges and becomes a world of duality, of all the forms, breaking apart into all opposites, is not condensed. It is literally refracted. Just as waves rise out of the ocean of consciousness, so in a still ocean, perhaps at low tide, but when there's no wind, we see literally a big, not so quickly vibrating ball of water, or not ball, but container of water. This is Shiva. So she dissolves the universe back into the Bindu, into Shiva. Subsequently, she becomes the springboard for the emergence, the Unmesha of the universe once again, as it surges forth out of this condensed consciousness. So I think at this point, if you have your handout called the 12 Kalis of the Krama lineage out, I'm going to cheat a bit and ask you to sort of open it up and ignore everything but the last page, where you should see a geometric design of triangles and so forth, which I don't seem to see. There we go. This is on page 5. So this is the basic format. Try not to get interested in the Mahakali image, because we'll get to that. All right, discipline. But what we see here is what we're talking about on page 5 of the 12 Kalis handout. In the center is the Chidgana, the massive and yet completely condensed Big Bang of Shiva consciousness. We can look at this two ways: as the dissolution of anything back into its source seed point in the womb, the upside down triangle in the center, which represents the feminine container for rebirth. Shakti is the Kutila, literally the turning point of power, the womb that births consciousness into form. Beautiful. And so this is Unmesha coming out towards us, or expanding out from the center, expansion or birth. And of course, Nimesha, if we look at this as flowing back towards the seed point in the center. So you can keep that open, and maybe we'll refer to it again. So he next says, where am I here? The goddess is perpetually engaged in activity, yet she's always complete. She's always full. Purnatva. Shakti is the volitional wave, the Urmi on the ocean of consciousness that is Lord Shiva. So the wave is the most common image given to understand Shakti and Shiva. We cannot separate the wave from the ocean. The ocean is qualified by the volitional movement called waves, and a wave is not a thing. It's an energy movement, a pulsation. This is spanda. So by Urmi, or wave, Kshemaraj means spanda. And what is the quality of a wave on the ocean? It's worth repeating over and over. At least I hope it is. A wave rises, Unmesha, pauses, sthiti, and then, or seems to pause and come to its peak moment, and then Nimesha dissolves back into the ocean. And all of this is simply the flux or the flow of Shakti. Yet she's always complete. Now, why would he bother saying that? Why say that she is always full in and of herself? The reason is that when we normally think of movement, when we think about volition, the suggestion, at least unconsciously, quite often is that we are not complete. I move from A to B to acquire something, to accomplish something. My breath betrays that delusion, however, because it's simply consciousness moving in and out of my body. Although my ego may say, yes, but I will end unless this breath is accomplished. Well, the tantric answer to that is you can never end. Your Shakti, maybe this form will end. So energy itself, Shakti in this form, is complete. It is not movement for a purpose, is what I mean to say. We have goals, we have purposes in our daily activities when there is something to be completed. So the only reason that she can possibly be vibrating in this dynamic dance called life, as the continual waves of creation and destruction, as we will find out, is for the sake of pure joy. And this is going to be really clarified for us in a beautiful way in just a bit by Gyananetra himself, the founder of the Krama lineage, who will give us an exquisite definition of the great mother, Kali, who is Shakti. So she is always complete. Just as the ocean is not less complete when it gives rise to waves, so it is that the wave is complete even as it moves through its cyclical flow of formation and dissolution. And yet we experience the changes of life painfully. And this is, of course, because we get caught up in a certain level of awareness that has as its quality constant change. That is to say, turbulent change, the wave-like ups and downs of the surface awareness of our sensual world. So this isn't just some pithy philosophy. What we're moving into now is this glorious teaching that says that there is nothing wrong with the world. There is nothing wrong with all of the opposites that are the condition of the world. Nothing has gone wrong or awry. But we suffer. And the reason we suffer can only be realized if we take a different vantage point of our own awareness. If we learn to plunge deeper than the surface waves of thoughts and emotions in our daily yoga practice. And so for Kshema Raja and the Shakta or goddess-worshipping tantrics, the phrase samsara, which some of you may know, it's a very ancient term. The Buddhists made it quite famous. And it literally means, or comes to mean, transmigration or rebirth, but literally means cycling, going in circles. Samsara. Sara means to flow. But when you have the prefix som before it, this means a stabilized flow or a continual flow. So in other words, a cycle. Now, have cycles been painful? Absolutely. Because unless we learn to accept and even, of course, from there, transcend the cycles of ordinary existence, we get beat up by them. We get beat up by gain and loss. If you've ever heard anyone say, I'm going through a hard time, I'm experiencing a lot of change, that's what we're talking about. When the reality is change is all that there is. So when somebody says, I'm suffering or I'm having a hard time because I'm going through change, I would reword that to say, and I'm trying to do this in my own practice, I am experiencing pain because I forgot that change is all that there is. And I've clung to an ummesha, let's say, an expansive state of my life or an expanded state of awareness. And I wasn't ready to accept that Shakti is just as divine in death. And Kali means death. And she's celebrated as the Great Mother, as we'll find. So he tells us, in order to end samsara, not rebirth necessarily in and out of a physical body, but getting caught up in the whirlwind, or you might say the whirlpool of drama, of dramatic emotions and thoughts that will constantly be in front of us. What we are to learn is a different system of yoga, a yoga that allows us to transcend these states while harmonizing and accepting them as a liminal and non-threatening layer of our infinite cosmic awareness. So this is what he says. Swasam Vedana Siddham Imam Yugapad Evon Mesha Nimesho Baya Rupam Pratibam Bhagavatim Vichinvam Tu Mahadhiya Sansara Vichedaya. In order to end the painful cycles, or the cycle of transmigratory experience, in order to end one's entanglement, not with the mind, this isn't Patanjali here, but rather with the continual ups and downs of one's emotional body, one's turbulent thoughts. In order to end this experience, the wise closely observe or focus on the luminous form of the goddess of consciousness as she simultaneously projects the experiences of expansion, or if you like, emergence, birth, and contraction, as they are enacted through one's own awareness. So we started with his discussion of expansion and contraction on a universal scale. And now we've literally localized the same experience, the same pattern. Shakti moves in patterns, as it is experienced in our own heads, through our own awareness. He doesn't give us the answer, but he gives us a tantalizing clue that a wise person is one who settles into the still points, the sthiti, the moments of stasis between the expansions and contractions of thoughts, and particularly from the point of view of classic tantric yoga, of course, the pause between the expansion of the inhaled breath and the exhaled breath, which is the contraction phase. Inhalation, unmesha, new life, new birth, new expansion, literally of the chest. And contraction, the release of carbon dioxide, the death of what doesn't serve my body. And with that, with judgments, I also release that don't serve my life. Unless I'm doing this consciously, tuning in with the goddess who is that coil, that kundalini between expansion and contraction, that center, that heart power, then I get caught up in the transmigratory word. I got in trouble with this word for some reason. Isn't that strange? Well, we all have our stumbling blocks. Transmigratory experience of the mental world. And interestingly, as a good poet, he uses samvit. Samvit's the feminine word for consciousness. And then below that, samvedana. They're from the same root, which both mean awareness or consciousness. So what he's saying here, of course, is that once we tap in with that supreme goddess of consciousness, she will pervade and expand one's own awareness. There's a great poem by the sage Paramahamsa Yogananda, who wrote the legendary work Autobiography of a Yogi. After he had his great samadhi experience, he wrote this, a poem called Samadhi, in which he repeats this line in utter ecstasy. He says, I now experience the little bubble of me floating in the ocean of thee. I experience the awareness that is the little bubble of me as part of the ocean of thee. There's no separation. We are waves of the great ocean of Shakti. And so the one quality of spiritual awakening that is universal in all mystical tradition, of course, is the expansion of consciousness beyond the liminal world of the mind, of judgments, of name, of identity, of post-it notes, of self-prescribed contraction in which we forfeited our own inherent freedom. So, the 5 acts of consciousness, or panchakrityas, that Sanskrit phrase will show up somewhere below, are a part of this system. Now, we know all about, so far, emergence and dissolution. These 2 terms come from our first verse, Unmesha and Nimesha. Other words are given here that are common synonyms. For Unmesha, we have Udaya, which means to rise, Shrishti, to create. To dissolution, Nimesha, which means contraction or dissolution. We also have Pralaya, Samhara, dissolution, death. Now, in between these, of course, is stasis. You cannot have the movement from birth to death without stasis. And we can think of this as a pivotal point. If we're talking about the breath, then, of course, expansion, Unmesha, as I just said, is in-breath, but that gentle pause between the two, where the breath literally turns from a downward movement to an upward movement, that brief moment is stasis. I used to translate sthiti as maturity, which is a little awkward, but we can think of this as a human life. All things that we experience in objective reality move through these 3 phases. There is a mature turning point phase between the rise of things, or the birth, or the growth of things, and the flip side, which is the death, the dissolution, the decay of all things, or all movements. And this includes the subtle world of thoughts. Thoughts are like waves. They rise forth out of the deep ocean of awareness, Unmesha. They crystallize into meaning, let's say, stasis, and then dissolve back into the ocean of awareness. That's to say, back into your core witness self. And we know this because we can watch our thoughts, and therefore it's proven that there is a witness, a deeper, wider, expansive sense of awareness behind thought, and that's what we're after here. So 4 and 5 are not obvious to us, and this is where it gets interesting. What we're talking about now is twofold. We're talking about Shiva, yes, but we're also talking about Shiva as me, as you. That's to say that the flow of our awareness is the movement, the Shakti of consciousness. And so at our deepest level, we are that ocean, we are that supreme Shiva. But this is concealed to us, Vilaya, here in Sanskrit. And some of you that have studied this stuff have heard other terms like niyati, but Kshemaraja uses a synonym, Vilaya, which means concealment. What is concealed in concealment? What does this mean? Now we're referring specifically to one's highest consciousness, one's true self, one's Sat Chit Ananda, that core of being, consciousness, and bliss, which does emerge, which is revealed, Anugraha, number 5, in rare moments in life, which we call peak experience, perhaps we call it getting high, moments when something just comes together perfectly in our sensual world. Most of you that have studied with me have heard me say this time and again. We've journaled, some of us. Some of you in this call now have journaled about what is the unique quality that connects peak experiences, whether it is an athletic high, whether it is a lovemaking high, whether it is an intellectual high of accomplishment, whether it is the high of love, looking into someone's eyes. The singular quality in common in all of these different peak experiences is the revelation of an expansion of consciousness of joy, or perhaps not even joy, but of power, even in moments of suffering, which has the effect of dissolving chitta vritti. Chitta vritti nirodha. Now, what is chitta vritti in our 5 acts? Simply, it is emergence, dissolution, and stasis, because as I just said, all thoughts rise, crystallize, and dissolve. So the constant cycle of this is considered to be the first three acts of Shiva. Let me say that again. It's a critical point. The first three acts represent, in our awareness as well as in our breath, which powers thought, which times itself with thought. We have chitta vritti, the whirling of awareness, the turning or the circulation of anxious thinking, chitta. So concealment is the effect of this, and revelation is the reverse, the opposite, the antithesis of concealment. That's to say, if you, and I'll give you this brief practice, if you sit down and meditate on a recent or perhaps not so recent peak moment, some treasured experience in which you could say to yourself, you know, I don't know if I've ever been as high as that. That's one of the greatest highs I've ever had. Well, with some meditation, everyone on this call will realize, if you can think back to the experience clearly enough, that the normal chatter of the mind, such as the engagements of the future, preoccupations with the past, being neurotic about something, the quality of thought is that it's always shooting off into the past or future. And here, in moments of peak experience, there's nothing but pure presence. This is the presence of God. This is anugraha, revelation. And so thought does not have a role in this. Thought falls to the wayside, as if the circle of thought buzzing around our head, in our head, suddenly seems a bit more distant. And all of us have had that experience if you've ever been high. Sure, thoughts come crowding in afterward to analyze the high, but I'm talking about that moment of Sat Chit Ananda. This is also called yoga. Yoga is to connect with that divine source that is within us. Sure, there's a trigger out there. There's sunsets. There's the joy of looking at a loved one that triggers a high. There are moments in our lives that we say, wow, that person really made me happy. But from the tantric point of view, none of these things ever made you happy. They triggered or reflected the light of joy that is within you. For if your joy came from these others, then let's say it's a person, that person would make everyone joyous. Why just you? Or why you in this particular way? It is because they're a special trigger for your own natural Shiva consciousness. So normally this is concealed to us, number 4, when our chitta is vrittering all around, which is most of the time, most of the day. So the goal of this yoga is to identify, not with Shakti in her constantly rotating forms of unmesha, nimesha, but to hold on, to focus on these moments of sthiti, number 3, to break through the veil, to dive into the ocean of awareness, and to see who we really are. These are the 5 states, or rather acts of consciousness. We'll break in about 5 minutes for questions, but we're going to get through this chart first. Okay. Shemaraja says, the death of the many forms of duality, meaning to say the dissolution of anything in the objective world, which has as its quality dualism. Anything that can be thought of, named, identified, has an opposite. And so if we look at our mandala or our chakra from the end of our other handout that we were just looking at, we can see that there are triangles pouring forth out of the center, but they are all of the same essence. And so these are the forms of duality: night and day, you and me, light and dark, young and old, etc., etc. And this is chitta vritti. When we focus on that seed point in the womb in the middle, that congealed, that contracted, in a good way, contracted consciousness in the heart, that coiled power, we identify with the goddess. This is what we're after. So the death of the many forms of duality, he says here on page 2, is also birth, for it causes. Death causes the rebirth of new forms. Life comes out of death. We see this in the forest. We see this in our own family, in our own flux of thinking. The Buddhists are big on this. Watch how life is born out of death just in your thinking. One thought dies and gives birth to another. So birth and death are absolutely illusory. They are phantasms of consciousness insofar as that they are impermanent and they are interdependent. If I die, when I die, not if I die, when I die, what do I mean when I say that? I'm dying every time I inhale and exhale. Carbon dioxide to a huge number flows out, and I inhale the oxygen that creates new body. And yet there is consciousness behind this. When I leave this physical body, it's like a wave that crashes on the sands of time itself. And what happens to my wave? It simply resorbs itself completely whole in its integral essence back into the ocean of awareness. So birth and death are absolute illusions. There is no loss unless we think there is. Yet the goddess who surges forth, he says, as if creating and then destroying various forms, is free of these changes, for in reality nothing really arises, nor does anything die. There is only the goddess Spanda Shakti. Stasis, number 3, concealment, number 4, and literally grace or revelation, anugraha, number 5, are nothing other than expressions of emergence and dissolution. In other words, the 5 acts performed as the inherent functions of the Supreme Lord are products of Unmesha and Nimesha. We know this from looking at our chart on the next page. This is I know it's a bit cheesy, but it is the hardest thing I've ever created on a computer. So, yes, you can give me a round of applause. I'd appreciate it because I'm utterly, utterly brain dead when it comes to computer graphics, and yet I managed to make this at 3 a.m. Anyway, here are the 5 acts. Now, notice, first of all, that we do not have the 4th listed here, and I'll explain why in a moment. The creation of any form, whether it's the movement of a wave out of the ocean, the rise of a thought, the movement into my body of a breath, the birth of a child, the dawn of a new day, I mean, the list goes on infinitely, gives rise, flowing to the right, to a pivotal point of transition, which we call sthiti, stasis. This is number 2, although it appears twice, but it's the second act in the list. And, of course, all waves must fall, all lives must come to a conclusion, all breaths must be exhaled, all thoughts must dissolve. This is number 3 at the bottom of our circle, samhara, 3rd act, dissolution. And, of course, there's a second stasis because at the end of our out-breath, there's a pause before we inhale again, shrishti, creation. There is a pause before the wave, having crashed and dissolved on the sand, reverts and pulls back and forms itself once again. So the circle in which we have the constant flux of birth, stasis, death, is vilaya, concealment, the 4th act of Shiva. Meaning to say that the constant cycle of birth and death that we experience on all levels all the time is experienced as the cycle of the mind, which is doing the same thing. Our mind is the same prakriti as nature. That is to say, it follows the same rules. It consists of thoughts that are born, live for a bit, and die. The cycle of the mind, chittavritti, is supposed to be this little donut I put here at the bottom of the chart where it says vilaya, number 4. So in other words, our true nature is concealed to us, the spanda source is concealed to us when we are caught up in the cyclical flow of time itself. When we identify the changing forms of reality as permanent forms by accident and seek to cling to them, and recognize experience suffering because I'm going through a lot of changes. Well, the yogi is one that cultivates change, that dances with change, that gets drunk on change because she learns to root in the core, which is number 5, in the state of eternal grace the revelation of the divine, of Spanda Shakti that transcends these very movements. And we'll see this now in an actual series of images of the ocean. So before I ask, I'm about to ask questions, so type them in if you have any. I have some comments in blue here. I probably won't go through them. Let me see. Yeah, well, I basically just explained this. So these are notes on what I just said. The second section there in blue, underlined, divine revelation at the top of page 4, is to identify with the ocean. So using the ocean analogy, we are to imagine that the entire ocean, from the very top, from the waves all the way to the lowest depths, we are to imagine this is our consciousness in its different expressions. So, to experience the revelation of the divine is to identify with the pure expansiveness of the ocean itself and not just with the flitting, transitory waves on the surface. And if we pause there and reflect, as Eckhart Tolle does in one of his books, I think in The New Earth, or perhaps his first book, The Power of Now, he says the core illness, the core dis-ease of the entire world, that is the source of all suffering. That is the source of poverty, racism, hatred, bigotry, oppression, and even the source of the effects of these things on the earth, degradation of the earth. The source singular disease, he says, is addiction to chitta vritti. That is to say, over-identification with the waves of spanda, over-identification with change, and, of course, as a result, being threatened by it. How many people do you know in your life? How many times in our own lives have we suffered because we were not ready to let go or to accept a positive, potentially positive change that's coming to us? In other words, clinging to life is not spanda because Shakti is energy. And yet we can get tossed around on the boat of our bodily existence if we're just riding the waves of the ups and downs of life. So we seek to dive into the ocean. This is Tantric Yoga, and it occurs in moments of stillness where we can actually begin to expand our awareness to a deeper, slower, beatific pulsation that we barely feel moving. This is the heart of consciousness. So let me pause there, and we'll see if there's questions and hopefully get through the peak moment of the night, the Shakti Chakra. Okay. I guess I have to go to Meredith to see if there's anything.
So we do have a number of questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them during this period. So I will make sure that any questions that were submitted that we do not get to get posted to Facebook for Chris to answer, and you all can find the answers there. But let's take a couple.
Can I ask? I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry, Meredith. I'm sorry. Are there, so approximately how many do we have, roughly?
There's about 5 right now.
Okay, then I think what might be best to do is, why don't we try to get through this Shakti Chakra business, because what I'd like to do is I'll definitely try to end before 7:30 Pacific time, and we'll begin answering questions, but I will stick around after that and make sure we get to all of them, because my concern is if we have this many that we may totally knock out our 86 Shakti Chakra. So in other words, we'll get to all of them if we could wait a few more minutes and take a breath in and release them for just another 20 minutes or so. How does that sound? Meredith's the boss. What do you think, Meredith?
Whatever works. That sounds fine.
Okay. Let's just do that, but hold on to we have your questions. You don't have to hold on to them. See, that's the beauty of this program. We already have them. You can't forget them. Okay. So, the meaning of Shakti Chakra. Now this is from the verse itself. This is the second line from verse 1, in which, again, we see this great expression that Shiva, or consciousness, is the source or origin for the unfolding or surging forth of what is called, in verse 1, Shakti chakras, or literally cycles or circles of powers. And I've repeated the English translation of the verse here in the smaller font on page 4 under the meaning of Shakti chakra. We praise Shiva, who is that source of the consciousness source that proliferates or that gives rise to the circles of Shaktis through which the universe comes forth into existence and dissolves into dissolution. Now, right away, Akshay Maharaja is going to turn us on or tune us in with the core teaching of the Krama lineage, which he claims is the source of the Spandakarikas. In other words, the Spandakarikas comes from the Krama, which is the first tradition to celebrate the divine as dynamic, the Krama. So he defines Shakti chakra in this way. Reiterating the verse, I praise Shiva or Shankara, who is and the connotation is the sun here, we'll get to that in a minute, but who is the source, the Prabhava, by which the verse means the cause of universal manifestation, Vibhava. That is to say, the Shakti chakra, the universal manifestation of consciousness is what? The joyful play that becomes the cyclical urge to create, to manifest, to then experience manifestation. And here we have the phases again. We have Shrishti, Sthiti, followed by delighting in that experience of dissolution, Samhara. Of what? The circle, chakra. And here he gives it away. That this circle of powers of Shaktis is the 12-fold goddess circle of sun rays, which include the following Kalis: creative Kali and passionate Kali. Now pause there. So the analogy is that Shiva is Prakasha, which means the sun, the source, light of consciousness, and the rays that literally cast out and create the phenomenal world are the vibrations of that sun. The light itself, these are the rays of Shakti, of power. And this can get us into a whole tangent we don't have time to get into, but I can remember vividly when I read Autobiography of a Yogi, after Yogananda had his big awakening experience, which you can read about in the chapter of that book called An Experience in Cosmic Consciousness. Utterly blissed out, his awareness broke beyond the confines of this body and saw sea after sea of waves of birth, stasis, and death resorbing into one bindu of consciousness, and saw that it was streaming forth from his heart space. An absolutely beautiful testimony. And what does he say? He says, ultimately, I experienced it as consciously blissful light. He kept using the word light. And he says somewhere else, the universe is made up of conscious light that is scintillating itself into form. And we can think about this logically. Everything comes from the sun. The elements of our body come from the sun. Nothing can live without light, and nothing can be seen without light. So the understanding is that light creates objective reality. And so Shakti is objective reality, literally the scintillation of the source light. Okay, we'll get to who these Kalis are in a minute, but he goes on and says, for the teaching of the Krama lineage informs us that it is through the intimate connection of this cycle or this group of Shaktis with that awesome, fiery Bhairava as the Lord at the center of their circle, they constantly accomplish the play of emitting, sustaining, and withdrawing the universe. Now this sounds technical, it's not. Mantana Bhairava means literally the awesome churned up fire. It is the fire of pure consciousness, out of which the flames or the light rays of Shakti create the universe. If you like, this is the fire that is generated in the sacrificial altar and ritual, but it is also in Tantric Yoga the fire of the coiled power that is generated when we pause our breath in Kumbhaka. When we draw the cool lunar breath in, retaining the solar out breath, this is a full pot or belly full of air. The friction of this, into which is installed a specific mantra, the mula or root mantra, creates that fire, that awesome churned up fire that blazes up the Sushumna Nadi. So in other words, and let's be perfectly clear here, this Mantana Bhairava, or if you like, this churning fire, is in the center of 12 goddesses. Now, if that fire is the Kundalini power in the center of my body, that means these 12 goddesses somehow circle it in worship. And they are the phases of my own consciousness. So let's take a look then at the other handout called the 12 Kalis of the Krama lineage for just a bit. On the top, I've given a very brief overview of the first 3 generation of Krama masters. And I couldn't help myself, even though it's off topic, because as I think I mentioned last week, and you can find in the Intro to Tantra handout under Krama, we've already met Gyananetra, the founder, who had the experience of this in the cremation ground of the 12 goddesses that circled him in worship, and he realized that he had attuned with that source power of Kali, who dissolves time and space, who bestowed upon him the ecstatic experience of Jivan Mukti, living liberation. I mentioned that of his 17 known disciples, he bestows the robes of office, as it were, to 3 of his female pupils. There's only 3 that we know of. Keyuravati, you'll see here, Roman numeral 2, the one who literally has harnessed or imbues the coiled power. Sri Anika, the impassioned one, is what her name means. And I love the 3rd, Sri Kalyanika, the kind-hearted master or mistress, I guess. These are all women sages. They are the first in Indian history or in Hindu history. And I couldn't help but put this in here because Keyuravati in particular is really honored. Now, we have no writings by her, but listen to this description that I found at 4 a.m. last night. It's an anonymous source reported in the Tantra Loka that honors Keyuravati. Now, you have to realize there's never been a woman lineage holder before, and we had up till 4 a.m. last night, I guess earlier today, we've never had a description of her. We just know her, name and rank and file. So some anonymous source reports, I give honor to Keyuravati, that famous goddess of a woman who lived without a home. This is a real woman, folks. This is, we're calling her a goddess, but, just to be clear, we're not talking about a Kali here. This is a human being, okay? It is said that because of the flood of immortal nectar, triggered from repeatedly fixing her inner gaze in the sky of pure consciousness, she radiated or emitted a glow that came from constantly identifying the entire universe as one with her very self. This was some lady. One of her immediate disciples is Erika, and what I love about Erika, other than his incredible writings, although we have very little of them, is that he is the co-disciple of all 3 women, not just one of them. So you talk about a character well immersed in the Shakta or feminine side of things. Okay, anyway. So Krama definitions of Kali. When we talk about Kali, we must identify the word specifically because Kali is the goddess of the Krama, and she represents the core power of consciousness itself. Gyananetra gives this exquisite definition of Mahakali, in which the very act that symbolizes, or that is symbolized in her name, she's the great annihilator. Why? Because She is the power that continually perpetuates the waves of existence, the births and the deaths that pain so many people. She's the one that annihilates things, just as she creates them. This is what he says. Mahakali ti samyasa parampaya kramodita sarasadhyakta sadbhava paramananda nandini. I just love this name he gives Kali. Paramananda nandini. She is called the Great Annihilator because she continually perpetuates the stages of existence in an endless succession. Yet her true nature, which is beyond the categories of being and non-being, is the ecstatic delight of unimaginable bliss. Beautiful. Sri Erika, the disciple of the three women masters, follows up with, praise be to Kali, who devours the cycles, the great cycles of time. She is inconceivable, indestructible, and unattainable. Of course, what he means is with the ordinary mind, which is caught up in her activity, in creation, stasis, dissolution. So the mind is a product of Kali's expression. It cannot find Kali itself. Therefore, we plunge beyond the ordinary surface mind to discover the source Kali. Oh, and then Jayarata adds to this rather banally. I don't know. I found it a little bit comic, so I put it in there. I mean, because what do you describe this force, this Kali, as? Right? He says, Kali iti Krishnapi. Kali just means dark one, meaning just leave it at that. Don't even go there because she's beyond all ideas. And the problem is, next thing you know, she'll have Post-it notes. No concept can describe her. Now, the word literally means, is the feminization of the word kala. Kala means time. So, awkwardly, we could say she's feminine time. But what the term has come to connote literally is death. Kali is death, but the death of ignorance. She represents that power that surges us back into full awakening. So let's just scroll to page 3 and leave that open, or if you have it printed out, just have page 3 called the 12 Kalis on your side there. And returning to the main handout, the 9-pager, let's take a look at page 5. Okay. So what is identified in these 12 Kalis? We're going to look at both simultaneously for another 10 minutes or so. Is that, without getting too technical into the nitty-gritty here, there are 3 phases of experience, of awareness experience, and innate to all beings. And the first is the experience of objectivity. And this is what we identify with as the first 5 acts of Shiva: creation, unmesha, stasis, sthiti, and nimesha, dissolution. Meaning to say, what we see out there. And out there includes the body and mind, because we're really talking even on a subtle level. Everything that we witness, let's be very clear, everything that we witness is in the flux of these 3 phases. What about this rock? Well, a rock is at a slower, it's on a slower time schedule, but it was formed. It will hit a point of stasis, of formation, and it will decay. Everything. Now, the word for objective experience is prameya. And prameya is the ordinary level of awareness of most people. That is to say, people identify with what they see: taste, touch, smell, hear, and feel. And this also includes what they see in their heads. We see thoughts as objects. We see emotions as objects. And if we identify with pure objectivity, which has the function of rising, pausing, and falling, of birth, stasis, and death, we get caught up in the turbulent flux of this. This is called suffering if we don't know that there's more to experience than this. So this is letter A on the main handout, Prameya, objective experience. And here we have it. And we can think about the wave. The first function or the first act of Shiva, Shrishti or Unmesha, is the emergence. Shakti is the wave. Shakti is the energy that arises out of the ocean of consciousness. The second function, if you scroll down a bit, is, as we've covered, sthiti, stasis. And here you see that pivotal moment. I tried to capture as best I could here. The wave has crested to its full peak potential. It is literally between opposites. It is between the opposite of creation, or emergence rather, and dissolution. It hasn't crashed. Now this is a mirror. These images are a mirror of all of nature. And then the third, dissolution. Nimesha is, scrolling down a bit more to our third image, is the crashing of the wave that encapsulates all that is created and resorbs it back into the ground. What is the ground? Well, the ground here is the ocean. That is to say, out of the ocean the wave rises, comes to fruition, and dissolves back into. So what we really have are four functions, right? Or four particular acts. If we look over at our 12 Kalis handout, we see there are four here under objectivity. The first four of the 12 Kalis that are worshipped, that are honored, are simply those phases, those powers of awareness that identify with thought, with the creation of a thought, with the maintenance of a thought, numbers 1 and 2. Shrishti Kali, the goddess of the Kali of creation, gives rise to a thought. Sthiti Kali crystallizes it for a moment. The third goddess, Samhara Kali, dissolves that thought or that wave thought. And who is the ocean? What is the name of the Kali that symbolizes the ground out of which thoughts rise and fall back into? I love it. She's called Rakta Kali, Passion Kali. Why? Because remember, we're talking about pure projection to the outside world, to thought itself, but also to the outside world. She's passionate to experience life. She loves to engage the cycles of time, the cycles of emergence, stasis, and dissolution. These are the first four Kalis that are honored. But this does not mean that these Kalis, or just honoring these Kalis, leads to a state of happiness. For indeed, the first four represent the experience of 90-something% of all human beings. Most human beings do not go beyond the first set of Kalis, meaning to say the first four, the objective ones. Most people don't even bother to think about who is thinking. What is behind my feeling? What is the source of awareness? Is there something more than the fleeting thoughts? Is René Descartes true when he says, I think, therefore I am? This tradition says only if you're at levels 1 through 4. You are what you think. You feel. In other words, at this sheer level of objective focus, we allow ourselves to get swept up in the constant and often painful transitions of life. This is the source problem or illness of the entire world, is preoccupation with these first four Shakti phases. Of course, they're given fancy names, but this is a very simple teaching. We know that these exist. We know that we have an inner witness that sees it. So, these are the waves. Now, if you scroll down just a bit more to the top of, not sure where we are here, next image, where it says the fourth function of Shiva, the experience of concealment, the fourth act. When we are caught up in the waves of creation and stasis and dissolution with clinging to the next thing, with mourning everything that is lost to us as if we've lost a piece of our soul instead of witness the natural transition of consciousness into new form. It's as if we're watching this kind of stormy image here, the next picture under the fourth function. Here you see all of them in one image. You see waves pulling back, shrishti, peaking, sthiti, and crashing, samhara, dissolution. And this turbulence is chitta-vritti. This turbulence is ordinary experience in which the divine is concealed from us when we identify with the goddess powers of pure objectivity. 3 minutes to go. We'll repeat this at the beginning of next week too. So what we'll dive into next week is the next two ranges, which is what it means to begin to gradually in our yoga have periods in our practice where we withdraw our awareness. If you look, the next image I've provided, you see here that the equivalent to this withdrawal is to dive, to literally transcend. The Sanskrit word is samavesha, to immerse beneath or below or behind the turbulent waves of thinking, to still the breath. And here you see that above where we are, a few feet below the surface in this image under the fifth act of Shiva, we can see that the waves are still moving about up there. The next image shows it even better. We haven't fixed anything. We haven't solved our problems. We haven't fixed the problems of birth and death, of gain and loss. Problems are constantly going to be there because the first four kalis are always active. They're constantly creating this turbulence. But yet, we dive deeper. And now we're at the layer in which we begin to identify with not the objects, the waves out there, but rather the act of perception itself, where we become quiet inside and see, wait a minute, I don't have to identify with all that turbulence in my head. This is a subtle spanda called pramana, the pramana experience, to identify with the act of perception itself, wherein we can sit and still our breath and calm our mind and get into our postural yoga and let go of all that maddening chitta-vritti that is of the first four kalis. The maddening chitta-vritti that constantly wants to engage in analyzing everything. This creates anxiety. Instead, we simply witness as if submerged under the surface of the ocean. And before long, well, perhaps that's what Kshemaraja says, before long, by immersing even a little bit into perceiving perception, and just watching the coming and going of the modifications of thought, we begin to feel a tremendous peace and to submerge even deeper into the experience of the third class of goddesses, that of subjectivity. To experience the subjective self as one with the ocean of consciousness, to realize, to literally draw attention even away from the waves. In stage B, we're still looking at the waves but not identifying with them. But in stage C, we begin to look elsewhere. We look at the titanic ocean of consciousness around us and begin to realize, this is what I am. This is what I am. I am not just that turbulence. I am this expansive state of tranquil bliss. The word Shiva means quiescent, tranquil. The quiescence of pure bliss consciousness that is the core source of all beings that we tap into when we have peak experiences and dive for just a fleeting glimpse into this ocean in moments we call highs. This yoga teaches us that this ocean is available to you all the time. 21,600 chances a day we have to plunge between breaths into the ocean of our true witness self. And beyond that, the 13th power, the great annihilator herself, Mahakali. So next week we'll begin by, I'll go through this system again, and we don't even know much about it. I'm not going to really get into the nitty-gritty on what each particular of the 12 kalis represents. But they are the key thing is that they're broken into three groups, which are the three phases of awareness that one can experience. The awareness of objectivity, the awareness of pure perception, and that subjective awareness in which the heart space begins to expand beyond the confines of ego until nothing is left but Shiva. So with that, I'd like to close with a quotation, and then we will take questions. And that quotation is as follows. Rather, a repeat, because I did not give the Sanskrit. This is so beautiful, and this really is, this verse by Kshemaraja, or the statement, refers to what it means to identify with that goddess power who is the shimmering, incandescent essence of the entire ocean of consciousness. What it means to identify with that instead of her turbulent expression, the waves of Chittavritti. He says to us, Sthiti vilayana anugrahanam vishishta pralayodaya rupatwan nari kamiti pralodayo yababhyam eva panchavidam parameshwaryam kritam sangritam. The goddess who shimmers forth in the mere illusion of creating and destroying forms, the waves of consciousness, is free of these changes. For in reality, nothing in your life is really being born. Nothing is really dying. There is only the goddess, Spanda Shakti. There is only the identification with the Supreme Lord, the source of consciousness that is constantly experiencing the play of life through your own awareness. Om Namostute Kshemaraja Ji, Om Namostute Jnana Netra Ji, and to our beloved Krama masters, our yoginis, our goddesses, I'd also like to bow. Om Namo Shri Kehuravati, Om Namo Shri Anika Ji, and Om Namo Shri Kalyanika, Om Namo Eraka, Om Namo Mahakula Ji. That's you. Thank you for your patience and time. Please check in with our Facebook discussion page, and please feel free to read ahead, read over these notes, and to remember, you get 10% of this in any session. You're on fire. We are all immersing into the Shakti in exactly the way we are meant to. Namaste and thank you. And with that, I'll hand it to Meredith. And for those that would like to stay for a few minutes of questions, please do. We'll see you next week otherwise.
Okay. Well, our first question comes from David. And we'll challenge my Sanskrit 101 skills a bit. But he's asking about the assertion that Jivan Mukta was novel to the Krama school, and he references the Upadesha Sahasri of Adi Shankara and mentions that in the prose part, when discussing the qualifications of a student, he states that a pupil should be a seeker after final release, while a teacher should be already released, Mukta. So presumably the teacher is still alive in this Jivan. So do you want to comment on that, Chris?
Yeah, sure. Well, here's the deal on that. Shankaracharya, the founder of the great movement of Advaita Vedanta, his dates basically, I mean, this is sort of arbitrary, but basically given to be about the 7th century or so AD. Now, at that point, the Tantric movement was very, very well established. In fact, it was the dominant tradition in South Asia, also Southeast Asia by that time, and Nepal, etc. And what he offers in his what is called non-dual Vedanta, or the teaching that follows the Vedic tradition and focuses on the non-dualism of the Absolute, is that there is only one Absolute called Brahman. Brahman means, or comes to mean, absolute. It's also equated to Atman, which is the soul of the universe. Now, in the core writings that are demonstrably attributed to him, and there are only a few, in which, in other words, we can prove were written by the Shankara, or Shankaracharya, the whole postulation of Advaita Vedanta is the denial of change, that dynamism, that transformation is an illusion, even though we experience it, and that when one reaches spiritual awakening, that illusion dissipates. And the main critique of the Tantrics, of course, and particularly of this school, the Spanda-based Tantrics, is that if the Absolute is all that there is, how can dynamism not be a real thing? How can you call it illusion when it's experienced? And so this is sort of an ongoing debate. And in fact, I kind of I made a mistake last week because I was off on the our syllabus. But Kshemaraj is going to directly refute Shankaracharya at least 3 times in this class. I think the first time will be next week. Anyway, the other, what is basically part of this doctrine is that liberation comes at death. Shankara, the original Shankaracharya, never ever says that one could be liberated while alive, or at least he certainly doesn't state that overtly, and it doesn't follow his doctrine. And the reason for this is that the experience of dynamism of the human body, let's say just breathing, locomotion, the 5 pranavayus, are change, while the enlightened master has dissolved the illusion of change and therefore cannot be living. And he says this somewhere. What we have is, beginning around, and my current guesstimation is, beginning around the 14th century, we have the very last movement of Tantra called became known as the Sri Vidya, and it got merged with Advaita Vedanta, meaning to say the doctrine of Shankaracharya. And it recapitulated Shankaracharya in a new light because the Sri Vidya is tantric and it does accept change. And so words are put into Shankaracharya's mouth, which supposedly contradict his earlier writings. And this is done to say that, people didn't read closely into his original teachings. I mean, that's pretty much bunk. This is a classic move where, you have all sorts of new doctrines that are redacted or retroactively placed in the mouth of some famous sage in order to give them credibility. But the original Shankaracharya, it doesn't even make sense in his doctrine to say that you could experience Jivan Mukti. Okay? Well, there's a part 2. Was there a part 2?
Not to the question. The next question, though, is from Scott, who would like you to spell the Sanskrit word for condensed consciousness that you referred to and that Kshemaraj used in the commentary on the first verse.
That's got to be Scott in L.A. Am I right?
Yep.
How did I know that? It's Chidgana, but let me get the exact phrasing that he uses here. Let's see. It's a great word. The thing about Sanskrit is that the words often mean what they sound like, So, yeah. Well, in this case, this one section, he says, Chid Ananda, so the bliss of consciousness that is Gana, G-H-A-N-A. That means condensed, focused. See, I can't find an English word that works. I mean, congealed. These are all sort of ugly words. It's a mass or a throb of consciousness. This is actually what Spanda is, which Kshemaraj said tonight. It is the condensed coil of pure consciousness, the bindu in the Sri Chakra, that springs forth into phenomenal existence. Okay?
Okay. Next question is asking if you could please elaborate on Kundalini as the coil between expansion and contraction.
Yes. If you wish, if you still have open that image of the, it's not quite a Sri Chakra or a Sri Yantra, but we'll call it a Sri Chakra for now. At the end of the Kali, the 12 Kalis handout, page 6, that may help. So in terms of the universe, Unmesha, or the expansion of forms, of opposites, of expressions, of the elements, of the tattvas, of differences, out of the seed point of Chitgana, of condensed consciousness, is created by Kundalini. Kundalini means the coiled power and coiled spring. So the understanding is that Shakti is literally the condensed pause before consciousness explodes itself or springs itself forth, as you see in this image, in every direction. Now, in the subtle body, this is experienced in the same way. The subtle body is a microcosm of the universe. This is in all the tantras. So the domain of Kundalini Shakti, that is to say, Shakti when she's getting ready to coil, is, and this might be surprising to many people, but is actually at the crown of the head. That is where she exists, or that is where she springs from. Now that, of course, is the in-breath. When we inhale, we breathe down, but the subtle essence of life force, jiva breath, inhalation, begins at the crown chakra. So Shiva, who is there also, remember Shiva is carried by Shakti. The essence of Shiva consciousness is coiled and springs downward with the in-breath. This gives you life, and every time you exhale, the inhalation has coiled back into the navel. So it's sprung downward. It has a stopping point where it's about to reverse, and this is called Kundalini also, because it coils and springs the out-breath back up. So Unmesha is Kundalini in terms of the subtle body, springing downward as the in-breath from the crown. Nimesha, Kundalini springing upward as the rising exhale from the navel. Now, when we say we're going to stabilize Kundalini, that's a whole other ball game. That is Tantric Yoga, wherein we seek to pause the moments between those breaths and to keep that coil stable for a longer period. And that draws prana to it, which creates a bigger coil, a coil that is powerful enough to not just spring up as out-breath, but in fact to spring open the central channel, which is normally inaccessible. So all of the tantras, almost all of them, have Kundalini depicted in this way.
Okay, and our final question of the night comes from John in Oakland, who also studies with Harish, and is wondering about Harish's description of Kshemaraj's heart of recognition, wherein he says that the phase of stasis is not to be held onto, but rather reabsorbed and reintegrated, becoming one with consciousness and thus not stuck in any one form or object of perception. Is that different from what you described in the class today?
That's a tough one because I'd have to see the Sanskrit of the Pratyabhigya Hridayam verse that he's referring to. I mean, it's absolutely true that sthiti has its limitations. I mean, kumbhaka, in terms of pranayama, the pause in breath in which we coil Shakti up, is an exaggerated phase. I mean, normally our breath barely pauses at all, even when we're very calm, but, you know, there's a noticeable coiling in those cases. But I think what he's referring to is the fact that the early tantras followed the old school system, which is that liberation can only happen at death. And therefore, the sthiti was thought to be the sthiti that creates this superpowered kundalini that breaks the granthis open, Once you exit the body through this power at death, that's it, you're done. What he's probably referring to is Shamaraj's revision vis-a-vis the Krama of this doctrine, wherein one does not have to wait till death, and sthiti is just a temporary phase. You harness it, you awaken all the prana shakti to coil into the heart, you break open the sushumna and draw the nectar of immortality down from the crown of the head and live in the state of jivan mukti. So he's probably saying you go on experiencing, he's probably connoting that one goes on to experience the normal expansions and contractions of life, but no longer identifies with pure objective reality, which we saw in our chart of the Kalis. So that's probably what he's referring to.
Okay, and that
I can ask him about a half hour.
That is everything that we have in. If anybody does have any final questions at this point, let's go ahead and have you put them onto the Facebook page, and Chris will get to them throughout the week before our next session.
And I will have the handouts to you much earlier, and I apologize. I had family illness issues which have been resolved. But in the meantime, please look through these handouts, and we'll pick it up next week. Thank you very much. Namaste.